is ask one just click that. Yeah, ask one main question. What does long-term global history tell us about the war in Ukraine and what might happen next? So that's my basic question. And I want to start from one of the most famous lines written by an ancient historian. Here we go. By the historian Tacitus, writing about the events of the year 69, when 4 different emperors all tried to seize the throne of the Roman Empire, and they're fighting everywhere. And Tacitus says, now was revealed the secret of empire, that emperors could be made elsewhere than at Rome. And what he meant by that is that wherever there was an army, an emperor could be made, because he understood an emperor is a man who has more violence available to him than anybody else does. That's what being an emperor means. Just having the upper hand in the use of violence. Now, this was something, Tacitus realized this because it was already been going on for a long time at Rome. That as early as the 80s BC, the Senate no longer really ruled at Rome because Marius, Sulla, Caesar, then other generals, these generals had more violence available to them than the senators had to fight back. Augustus really becomes the ruler of the Roman world after 31 BC, even though he keeps saying he isn't the ruler. But he has more violence available to him than anybody else. So he really is the ruler. And what Tacitus understands is that only the man with the most violence can enforce the rules that he imposes. And this remains true today. This, in fact, this is how a lot of sociologists define a state, is a society where a group of people monopolize the use of legitimate violence. So whoever has the violence can make the laws, they have to have the violence at their disposal to enforce the laws. And this, as I say, this remains true today, but something has changed. Now, even though rulers are still the people with access to most violence, nowadays we don't expect them to use it. And that, I think, that is why what happened on February the 24th of this year was such a shock around so many parts of the world. Nowadays, we tend to assume, especially in the West, that rulers should try to avoid using violence. The more a ruler uses violence, the less legitimate that ruler seems. But this is a very, very modern idea. It doesn't really go back more than about 250 years, and perhaps it only really goes back about 75 years. So I'm going to ask today what long-term history can tell us about 3 sub-questions related to the question I started with. And the first of these is, why do so many 21st century rulers try to avoid using violence? The second, why did Vladimir Putin invade Ukraine anyway, in spite of the way other rulers tried to behave? And then the third question, what might happen next? So that is my plan for the rest of this talk. So start. Why do so many 21st century rulers try to avoid using violence? And I think to understand this, we have to take a really long-term view. In fact, we have to look at the story across millions of years. Now, humans are like most other animals in that we have evolved biologically to be able to use violence to settle our disputes when we disagree with each other. And like other animals, we calculate the costs and benefits. I mean, other animals, even lions and tigers, they don't just attack everybody they see. They think about it. What will I gain from using violence? What will it cost me to use violence? But we differ from all the other animals in that we can weigh up the costs and benefits and then change how we behave by changing our cultures. Other animals can't do that. And the result is that we are the only species of animals that has ever changed how it uses violence and how much it uses violence without evolving biologically into a different kind of animal. And over the last 10,000 years, rates of violent death, the chance of any individual dying violently, these have fallen by about 90% across the last 10,000 years, which is amazing. Nothing like this, so far as we know, has ever happened here on Earth or, for all we know, anywhere else in the whole universe. So this is an amazing thing. Now, 10,000 years ago, everybody in the world was a hunter-gatherer. mostly living in small bands of people, moving around very frequently as different kinds of wild animals move around, as different wild plants migrate. Hunter-gatherers tend to have very weak institutions. And the hunter-gatherers, they're not fighting each other all the time, not killing each other all the time. But when they have a dispute, there are very few of the institutions that we are used to resolve these disputes. And violence is a much easier thing to resort to. And there's a lot of variation around the world. But rates of violent death among hunter-gatherer societies are perhaps as high as 10%. So each individual has a 1 in 10 chance of dying violently. Now, by about 3,500 BC, you're getting much bigger societies forming in the Middle East and creating governments being created by people who specialize in the use of violence. These governments the governments tend to tell the people they rule not to fight each other. And this is not because the governments are full of really, really nice people. We see pictures of some of the kind of people we're dealing with here. They're not really nice people. What the rulers want is for their subjects to work hard, to plow their fields, pay taxes to the rulers, and not fight each other. It doesn't help the ruler if two farmers burn each other's farms down. That's bad. So the ruler wants you to stop fighting and pay your taxes to the rulers. Only the rulers can decide who is allowed to fight. And they usually say, we have been told by the gods that we can fight. The rest of you can't fight. We can only fight when it suits what the gods want to happen. And one result of this, there's a lot of results, but one result is violence becomes less common within ancient states because the rulers are sending a message to the ruled. Don't fight. We have more violence at our disposal than you do. We will punish you if you fight. Only fight when we say so. So less fighting within the state. But when two states go to war with each other, the fighting is more terrible than ever. They have huge armies, like you see the Qin First Emperor's army and Terracotta army in China down at the bottom right there. So when they do fight, the wars are more terrible than ever. But then another thing happens over the long term, that eventually you get to the point where you'll have one empire dominating a whole region. Classic example, of course, the Roman Empire around the Mediterranean basin in the first 2 centuries CE. The Romans are very proud that they create what they call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And it's hard to be precise about the numbers on rates of violent death, but they seem to fall sharply from the kind of world you had at hunter-gatherers, where you're looking at 10%, 1 person in 10 dying violently before 10,000 BCE, to perhaps just half that, maybe 1 person in 20 dying violently, which is still a lot, but it's a lot less than it had been before. But then the rates of violent death go back up again once the empires start to break down. Now, there's a big change in the 19th century. So we're looking at long periods of history here. A big change in the 19th century when for the first time you get an empire, the British Empire, that is able to project its power globally, to reach all around the planet. But it behaves in the same way as other empires. The British Empire says, don't go to war unless we say it's okay to go to war. If you disobey us, wherever you are in the world, we will punish you, partly through our military means, but also through our economic means, our finance, our control of trade. We will punish you if you go to war without us saying it's okay to go to war. The British like to say they created a Pax Britannica, raises the costs of going to war for the rulers of other states unless the British approve of this happening. The British system then breaks down terribly between 1914 and 1945. Worse wars are fought than ever before. Probably more than 100 million people are killed in the 2 world wars, with Eastern Europe famously as one of the worst places of all. Probably about 40 million people die in Eastern Europe during the 2 world wars, maybe more than that. And after the Second World War, the world divides into Soviet and American spheres. But the big difference is there's now a very terrible new way of fighting through thermonuclear weapons. The costs of war rise much higher than ever before. The Soviet Union and the United States, very conscious that if they go to war now, billions of people will die. It'll be much, much worse than World War II. And they conclude rightly that the costs of using violence outweigh any possible benefits of using violence. So if the Soviets and Americans want to contend for global domination, they have to find ways to do that without it turning into a thermonuclear war. War has become unthinkable. Now, the way it turned out, of course, instead of billions of people dying, we now live in a world where the Soviet Empire has collapsed without there being total war. Americans often talk about us living in the age of a Pax Americana, an American peace. Global rates of violent death since 1989 fell to below 1%, so less than a 1 in 100 chance of dying violently. And this is global, so this includes places like Syria, Central Africa, where these terrible civil wars have been waging. By 2021, global rates of violent death had fallen to 0.2%, a 1 in 500 risk of dying violently. And again, of course, it depends where exactly you live in the world, what social group you come from. But this is a remarkable transformation. This is nobody in earlier history could have imagined we would ever live in a war where we could have moved that far toward getting rid of war. And maybe the most important statistic in this, the number of nuclear warheads in the world fell by 95% since the end of the Cold War. There's no longer enough weapons in the world to kill everybody in one day, the way there was in the 1980s. This is just a remarkable graph, the number of nuclear warheads in the world, over 70,000 in 1986. So, amazing long-term changes in the human use of violence, bringing us to a world where rulers normally try to avoid using violence. Something has gone very wrong if a ruler resorts to violence. So, my second question, why then did Vladimir Putin invade Ukraine despite of all these changes? And I want to suggest that there were 3 conditions required to make Putin move in this direction, despite the general direction that history has been heading. And the first of these is geopolitics, basically the geography of Russia and Ukraine. Looking at the history again, we look at Russian history. If we go back to the 14th century, and here is a map, I'm afraid it's too small to really see it very well, but a map of the gradual expansion of the power of the Russian state based in Moscow. If we go back to the 14th century, the main threat to rulers in Moscow came from the east, from the Mongols, which was, of course, the main threat to people in Ukraine as well. The Mongols burned Kiev down in 1240. In the 14th century, Russian rulers worry mainly about the Mongols. But by the 16th century, Russians are able to push back against the Mongols. They push their frontier eastward. They cross the Ural Mountains in 1598. They reach the Pacific Ocean in 1639. They shut down the Mongol threat. And since that time, Russian rulers have worried more than anything about the West. And there's a reason for that. If you look at the worst things that have happened in Russian history, in 1610, the Poles capture Moscow. In 1705, the Swedes besiege St. Petersburg. In 1812, the French capture and burn Moscow. In 1917, the Germans tear the Russian state to pieces. In 1941, 1942, the Germans almost do this again. So Russian rulers, I think quite rightly, look westward and say, this is where the big threats to Russia come from. They come from the West. And the main response, going all the way back to Peter the Great in the 1690s, is what historians sometimes call a Russian pivot to the West. Russians try to push their Western frontier as far away into Europe as they can to create strategic depth so that any army attacking Moscow has got to cover hundreds and hundreds of kilometers before they get there. And this long-term Russian strategy creates strategic depth, capture warm water ports that allow you to get access to the world's oceans. So the Russians occupy Crimea in 1783. A Russian army enters Paris in 1814. In 1945, Stalin puts the frontier on the Elbe River in the middle of Germany. So this is a very long-term Russian approach to what geopolitics means. And that's why Vladimir Putin came up with this famous line that the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989 to 1991, this, he says, was the worst geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, because it reverses 300 years of Russian strategy of pushing the frontier west, brings the frontier all the way back to within 500 kilometers of Moscow. This is the worst thing that's happened for a Russian leader since 1676. That's the last time the frontier was as far east as it is now. So that, I think that tells us something quite important. It's bad news, really, that Vladimir Putin is following a long tradition of Russian leaders in thinking that dominating Ukraine is really important to Russia. He's not an anomaly. This is not a one-time problem. Every leader since Peter the Great has wanted to dominate Ukraine. Most of them since Catherine the Great have actually done so. So seen from Moscow, it's not crazy for a Russian leader to think that Ukraine, allied with the European Union, and of course we heard just today, the Ukraine is now officially becoming a candidate to join the European Union, but allied with the European and the United States, Ukraine poses a geopolitical threat to Moscow. So that is the bad news, I think, out of thinking about the geopolitics. The other side of it, though, is there's no reason for Russian leaders to think that the appropriate response to these geopolitics is to act violently. That's a choice they make. It's not necessary to do that. The European Union and the United States have expanded into Eastern Europe since 1991, but they didn't do it violently. They didn't send armies. German armies did not come back into Eastern Europe. They used soft power. Eastern Europeans wanted to be allies to the Western world. Many Eastern Europeans want to be part of this Western world. Now, Vladimir Putin has chosen not to compete with the West on soft power, not to compete by saying there are all these great things that you will have if you become part of this larger Russian sphere. Instead, he's chosen to go to war. In 2014, he made that decision. This is not how most leaders react to their problems in the 21st century. So there's something special about Russia. I think that's very, very important. I think to understand it, we've got to look at two more conditions as well as the geopolitics. So the second of these is Russian strategic culture. And this is a very old idea among strategists, that different societies have different ways of thinking about strategic problems. It's an idea that Thucydides already understood well when he makes it very clear in his history that the Spartans turned to violence much more easily, much more quickly than most Greek states to solve their problems. And this is true in the modern world as well. Some states have traditions of thinking about strategy that favor violent solutions to their problems. And this is something Westerners have observed about Russia for a long time. And it was described most famously by George Kennan, an American diplomat, who sent this, what's called the long telegram, the secret cable, back to Washington, D.C. in 1946, trying to explain to American leaders how Joseph Stalin and the advisors around him saw the world. And he said that Stalin and his advisors stand before history at best as only the last of that long succession of cruel and wasteful Russian rulers who have relentlessly forced their country onto ever new heights of military power in order to guarantee the external security of their internally weak regimes. So Kennan was saying there's a long tradition of Russian rulers being quick to think that violence is the solution to their strategic problems. And with Vladimir Putin, we've seen him acting violently to restore strategic depth since the beginning of the war against Chechnya in 1999. He began doing this in Ukraine in 2014. But even so, this is a big change in 2022 to jump to this full scale of invasion of Ukraine. So why did that happen? And I think to explain that, we have to bring in a third factor, third condition for this change, which is a sense of an American strategic decline. Now, strategic analysts, when they look at the world today, very often will draw analogies between what's happening now and what happened to the British global order about 100, 120 years ago. And they particularly will draw analogies between the American decline since about 2001 and Britain's decline in global power after about the 1870s. I will often say that China is in the position now that Germany was in 120 years ago. But there are two great differences between the situation of a power like Germany in 1914 and the situation that Russia finds itself in now. And the first of these is that Germany was a great economic power in 1914, and Russia isn't. That's a huge difference in how modern Russia and 100 years ago Germany look at the world. But the second big difference is Russia has more nuclear missiles than any other country, which again changes the calculus and makes me suspect that Russian leaders are going to be more willing than any other 21st century leaders to gamble on the use of force, to take chances in the feeling that American power around the world is declining. Okay, so that brings me to the third of the questions I'm asking. Well, if long-term history can give us some sense of what the forces are driving the world that we live in, what might happen next? Well, go back to Thucydides again. Thucydides was very clear. No one can see into the future. There's a fog of war. Nobody knows what is going to happen. And all you can possibly do is guess. The problem, though, is that strategists have to make plans anyway. You plan now on what you think might happen in the future, because if you wait until it starts happening, your range of choices has already been narrowed down, been constrained by the other people you're dealing with. So you have to make plans now by trying to guess at where you think the future will go. And I think there are some things that we can say at this point. One is that no one can change geography. The geography is what it is. Seen from Moscow, Ukraine will always look like a threat. The idea that Ukraine might be allied with your enemies is always going to be a threat to Russian rulers. But that doesn't mean that they always have to try to solve that threat through violence. And the goal for strategists, putting it at a very abstract level, the goal should be to persuade Russian leaders that the best results will come through not using violence to try to solve their problems, that the costs of using violence are going to outweigh any benefits they can possibly get from them. And persuading other rulers of this is a very old question. We can see it going back at least as far as 1400 BC in the Middle East. You get a long period where Middle Eastern kings don't fight each other very much. They manage to persuade each other that the costs of going to war will outweigh the benefits that you will get from going to war. So in principle, this is a very simple question. The answer is very straightforward. What needs to be done? Well, we need to raise the costs and reduce the benefits from acting violently, while at the same time, raise the benefits and reduce the costs from acting peacefully. So when the two cross over, rational actors will cease to behave violently in the world because they will just be better off not behaving violently. And we've already seen this happening. The courage and skill of the Ukrainian fighting forces, the agreement among the Western allies to impose economic sanctions and provide military support, these have already raised the costs and reduced the benefits of Russian violence. I suspect strongly if Vladimir Putin had known how the first 4 months of this war were going to go, he would not have invaded Ukraine in February 2022. So progress has already been made on raising the costs and reducing the benefits of using violence to solve his problems. The problem with this, though, is that even in the best case scenario, raising the costs and reducing the benefits of using violence, all it does is generate a new Cold War. This is what the Americans and the Soviets did with each other in the 1940s, 1950s. They raised the costs of using violence through mutual assured destruction. Both sides knew that going to war meant total destruction, so they didn't go to war. But instead, they settled down into this Cold War that dragged on for decades and still killed millions of people. I think long-term history suggests that long-term peace only ever comes when you work on both sides of this equation. So as well as raising the costs and reducing the benefits of acting violently, you have to raise the benefits and reduce the costs for Russia of acting peacefully. And that, of course, that is where it gets difficult. There's been a lot of argument in just the last few weeks among diplomats over how do we do this? And Henry Kissinger, who's now 99 years old, Henry Kissinger got himself into trouble recently by proposing that Ukraine actually does need to make territorial concessions to Russia. There are deep disagreements on how Ukraine, how the West more generally can safely raise the benefits to Russia of not behaving violently. Now, it could be, of course, that there is nothing that can be done on this side. Maybe Vladimir Putin is just not interested in benefiting from peace. He wants to act violently. Just like Adolf Hitler was not interested in benefiting from peace in the 1930s, and trying to talk him into being peaceful at Munich in 1938 was a disaster. Napoleon was not interested in this in the 1810s, and attempts to talk him into being peaceful also failed terribly. Julius Caesar was not very interested in the benefits of peace in the 50s and 40s BC. Alexander the Great, not at all interested in the benefits of peace in the 330s BC. So there are some rulers with whom you cannot negotiate on both sides of the equation. Maybe we're dealing with a similar situation now. Now, in the end, with Germany under Hitler, France under Napoleon, these did become peaceful countries, Germany especially. But Germany only becomes a peaceful actor after being completely defeated and occupied by its enemies in 1945. France only becomes a peaceful actor after the same thing happens. Its army is completely defeated and it's occupied by its enemies in 1815. In both cases, long-term peace came at a terrible cost in lives ended and wealth destroyed. So taking the long-term view suggests that the current terrible war in Ukraine is going to leave us with one great question to answer, which is, can we find new ways to raise the benefits of acting peacefully without having to kill so many people as we've always done in the past? So that's where I'll stop. So thank you for listening, and thank you for joining this Zoom call at this terrible time.